Howdy Commanders, Echo here. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a look at just the on-paper component of a campaign reward ship, this being the USS Benham DD-397, the capstone reward for the current Steel Redeemer campaign in World of Warships Legends. I do not own this ship, so we are just going to be looking at it in port and what's available in the on-paper stats in port, but we can get a pretty good accounting of what the ship is going to play like just from that. So come along, Commanders, we're going to check it out, and we're going to take a look at just the on-paper part of the USS Benham. First, going to take a look at the 3 different module slots that you can choose from for the Benham. Slot 1, you've got aiming systems and main battery mod. It's a DD, take aiming systems. Slot 2, you got steering gears, propulsion, or damage control systems. I don't think damage control systems on a DD is worth anything. We're going to talk about a little bit later the choice between steering gears and propulsion. Either one of those are fairly viable options, roughly even with each other. It kind of comes down to playstyle, commander selection, skill selection on those commanders, and how you think you're going to be playing this boat. But either one of these on this ship looks like it could be pretty viable options. And then slot 3, you've got concealment system. Why you would ever even look at these 2 for a destroyer, I don't understand. Concealment system in slot 3 for the Benham. Now before we start digging into the stats proper, do want to give you a quick reminder that obviously we don't have any of those modules selected that we just talked about, and since we don't own the ship, there's no commander plugged in here. So keep in mind that these are the actual on-paper stats before modules, before commanders, before flags, etc. So these are the very base stats. I will be comparing them to ships that I own. I own every tier 6 tech tree ship. So those have builds, those have flags, those have modules, etc. I will try to account for those things occasionally here and there. I will be doing the math on some of these things as if there were commanders on them in sections of the stats that I feel it's particularly relevant. But just keep that in mind as we go through these on-paper stats, that there is no commander, no modules, no combat flags, or any sort of other influence on these Benham stats. So let's get into it here with survivability first. The Benham has 14,500 base hit points. That's 200 more than its US tech tree counterpart, the Benson. Again, versus my builds, and just always account for that from now on. I'm not going to say compared to my builds every single time, just always know that I've got every tier 6 tech tree destroyer built out with commanders, so just always caveat that with compared to my builds. So it's got 200 more than its tech tree counterpart, the Benson. This 14,500 is fewer hit points than the Moss and the Vauquelin, and it's more than the Minsk, Jervis, and Akatsuki. So you're kind of in the middle of the pack here with the Benham on paper in terms of hit points. Now you guys know me and my on-paper stuff, so we talk about a couple other things. So if we look at the Benham model, she's got a very low freeboard, especially the rear 2/3 of the ship there. Right behind the pilot house, you can see it drops, and that freeboard is barely above the water. In terms of real-life seakeeping, that might have been a nightmare, but we don't have to worry about that in our game. So what that translates to is a very difficult ship to hit, especially that rear 2/3 of the boat. Very little superstructure back there. I mean, unless shells hit that US flag flapping around, she's pretty hard to hit in that rear 2/3. Even the front 2/3 is not a terribly large ship. She's relatively close to the water even there. The pilot house is fairly squat, barely any higher than the one single funnel. Not a whole lot of superstructure for shells to get caught in as they come traveling, parallel to the water line. So anything getting fired at you from relatively close distance is going to be hard to hit from the enemies hitting you. Additionally, she's very narrow. If we take a look here, kind of at an aerial view, she is incredibly narrow. Look at how short that midship line is, and she tapers quite well into the front as well. Very difficult to hit with sort of plunging fire from at range, or if you're shooting directly at the stern of or the bow of the Benham, also very difficult target. Look at that. This is a tier 6 DD. It's super narrow. It's like looking at a piece of paper side on. It's just tiny. Decently hard to hit from what I can tell. She's also very short, so lengthwise you don't have a whole lot of ship to hit, so it might be, you know, kind of bracketing fire if you're shooting at range with anything like a inaccurate cruiser, battleship, etc. You might be getting a lot of splashes off her bow or her stern. So this is going to be a very difficult ship to hit, and that's one of the things under the survivability tab that is going in the Benham's favor. The front two turrets, the Alpha and Bravo turret, have, from what I can tell, fully enclosed or encased turrets, giving them a decent amount of survivability. However, the rear turrets, or rear guns rather, are not turreted in any way. They're fairly exposed. Looks like they're going to be much more easily knocked out, or at least temporarily disabled. The Zulu turret, the one closest to the stern, has a very slight lip. If you look where the deck on the Yankee turret is mounted, there is that very slight lip, so things coming sort of plunging fire over the bow and midships and landing near the stern might catch on that little lip and protect your Zulu turret just a little bit, but it's really not that much. And when you consider that the turret, or the gun rather, is not turreted, not protected by its own hood or shroud in any way, it's really not going to be a whole lot of protection for that gun. So those rear two guns, you're going to want to try to protect those as best you can by trying to use that little bit of superstructure there with the tower and going bow in at stuff to try to protect those rear two guns. Speaking of the Benham's guns, let's dig into those artillery stats. The Benham has 4 single 127mm guns, 2 fore and 2 aft, as we were looking at there, as we were talking about survivability. They've got a main battery firing range of 10.8 kilometers, a 4-second reload, and a 6-second traverse time. Fairly typical American destroyer stats, nothing super standout in that regard. You got that quick daka reload, and that really rapid traverse, which helps you in close range gunfights. They've got the best turret traverse among DDs in the entire game. Can't be beat in close in your face knife fighting brawls against other DDs. The HE shells have a base per shell damage of 1800 with a 5% fire chance. This gives you a 7,200 damage alpha strike. That's, of course, calculated with all 4 shells hitting, all 4 shells getting maximum damage. This gives you a 108,000 HE DPM, damage per minute. And obviously that's calculated by the number of shots you get in a minute times a maximum damage per shell hitting. Obviously those numbers will never be achieved because you're not going to get citadels with HE every single shell, but those are your maximum possible values, and that's just one way to calculate that and have a apples to apples comparison against all other ships. Your AP shells do 2,100 damage on a citadel, giving you an 8,400 damage alpha strike and 126,000 damage DPM. Now I haven't compared these to other DDs, but these are pretty decent gun statistics for US destroyer guns. There's nothing super standout here in terms of these on-paper stats. Now they do have the characteristic US destroyer gun ballistic characteristics, relatively floaty, high levels of drag in the air. So you've got really high arcing, kind of floaty guns, especially when you're pushing out to that 10 plus kilometer range, long time to target. And that's going to make it relatively difficult to hit targets that are evading. Now, floatiness of guns has nothing to do with actual precision. It just means that hitting, moving, and maneuvering targets is more difficult. Ballistic characteristics have nothing to do with precision or dispersion characteristics. So take that for what you will. If you're shooting at a relatively immobile target, something that's got an engine knocked out or a rudder knocked out and it's just traveling in a straight line, big, fat, slow, lumbering battleships, etc., these guns are still going to do a decent amount of work on those types of targets. Hitting long-range maneuvering destroyers might be a little hard with the Benham, but that's just very typical performance characteristics out of US destroyers. Nothing really different in that regard. Now if we take a look at the actual disposition of the guns, they're pretty decent. Again, as I mentioned, 2 forward, 2 to the rear. and the firing angles look pretty solid, especially on Bravo turret there. You can tell I'm kind of blading it here. That's going to have a really decent rearward firing angle on that Bravo turret. And Alpha isn't too much worse. You can also get a good sense of it here when we look at an aerial view. For the Alpha turret in particular, if you look at where the ship model has that kind of sliced off section there of the deck, I'll point to it here with some arrows. That's a really good indicator of your rearward firing angle on that Alpha turret. And Bravo, as we mentioned, is going to be even better around the pilot house, kind of there and there. So pretty decent rearward firing angles on the forward guns. And one of the kind of benefits of having non-turreted guns for the rear is that that allows them to have slightly better forward firing angles on these rear guns. So you can see here that they've got really nice forward firing angles, particularly that Yankee turret there. It can get around that tiny little bit of superstructure there with the flag really well to the front. So this is going to be great for close-in knife fighting. Combine that with that great turret traverse. You're going to be able to get a lot of guns on target while not exposing a whole lot of an already small ship to enemy fire. So this is going to be great for close-in knife fighting, getting all the guns on target, swinging around, and being able to knife fight other DDs or close-in cruisers. I'd be remiss if we didn't spend quite a bit of time talking about the Benham's torpedoes and their characteristics. It's probably the most standout feature of this boat, or at least the thing that immediately draws your eye, and that's the torpedoes on the Benham. So let's get into them. The Benham's got 4 quadruple launchers with an 85-second reload time, 9,233 base damage, 1.1 kilometer detection, with a 7.5 kilometer range and 56 knots in the water. I'd say the number one jump out at you type of stat on this page is that 9,233 per torp damage. That is incredibly anemic. There are tier 2 destroyers and tier 3 destroyers that have comparable per torp damage, and they're reloading in half the time or less. Now, when you also consider this 9,000 damage per torp against tier 5 through 7 battleship torpedo belts, and even some of the cruiser torpedo belts at this tier, that's going to do next to nothing. You're going to be seeing torps hitting that do damage in the 4,000 to 5,000 range. That's like cruiser Citadel AP type of damage per torpedo. And when you consider that the reload is nothing special and the range is kind of bad, that's really, honestly, poor performance out of torpedoes. 9,000 damage is just like jumps out at you as really, really anemic. Yes, you have 16 of them, but you only get 8 per side. We're going to talk more about these characteristics in a minute, but bottom line is the per torp damage of just barely over 9,000 is incredibly anemic. Let's talk about the reaction time on these torpedoes. The base reaction time, given these stats right here in front of you, is 7.55 seconds of reaction time. If you build them with a contact is imminent skill on your commander, this drops the reaction time to 7.05 seconds. If you build your commander with just an Azure Lane Atago, fairly high level, but no contact is imminent, that's going to drop the reaction time to 6.18 seconds. And if you combine both a high-level Atago and contact is imminent, that's going to drop the reaction time to 5.76 seconds. So you're shaving just about 2 whole seconds off of the reaction time if you stack contact is imminent with Azure Lane Atago. That's going to dramatically increase the number of torpedoes that you land, especially when you consider that 2/3 of the ships that you're going to be fighting, you know, everything in tier 6 and tier 7, in terms of battleships, you pretty much have to consider that those are going to be running the target acquisition module in slot 3, which is then going to counteract a lot of that reaction time, giving them, the enemy, being them, a better reaction time than those numbers I just listed. Yes, the tier 5s that you're going to be shooting at won't have that, but when 66% of the battleships you're going to be up against are going to have that target acquisition module, or at least you have to assume they're going to, then that makes those reaction times worse. So you want to probably do everything you can to make that torp reaction time as low as possible. Next, I want to talk about that 7.5 kilometer range on these Benham torps. As of the recording of this video, to my knowledge, there is no way to extend the range on these torpedoes. Now, to be fair, I haven't seen the two other non-US Halloween commanders yet. I know nothing about them, so they may have a base trait that could be slotted in as an inspiration to help extend this range. But there is no torpedo safari available to Burke, Halsey, Bumblebee, or the US destroyer commander from this Halloween update. So again, as to the best of my knowledge, there's no way to increase this 7.5 kilometer torpedo range. And we're going to see that come into play a little bit more when we talk about concealment, but as of right now, given the whole package of the rest of these stats, that 7.5 kilometer range feels a little on the short end to me, and I don't think it's going to be very comfortable. Some positives about these torps is that they've got great forward and rearward firing angles, and that's largely down to the fact that they're wing-mounted turrets. They're not center-mounted, so they don't have to worry about getting out and around, you know, the parts of the hull and the superstructure as much as center-mounted turrets do. This offers you much better forward and rearward firing angles. They've also got relatively narrow spreads. I have watched a little bit of footage of other people playing the Benham, noted the narrowness of the spread, and for a quad launcher, it's incredibly narrow. I haven't done a side-by-side comparison, but based on what I'm able to think about in my head, they look to be the narrowest quad launcher spreads in the game. Narrower than Kagero, Asashio, narrower than like Moss, etc. Any other ship that's got quad launchers, these appear to be the narrowest spread. So when you look at things like good firing angles, narrow spread, and decently short reaction time, this is going to lend themselves to decent torpedo DPM. Yes, any given torp doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but when you're able to land a lot of them, this is going to help your torp DPM. You're going to get lots of rolls at the dice, if you will, to start floods. Floods force out damage con. You got fast firing guns. You just land HE shell, HE shell, HE shell. Eventually you're going to hit that 5% fire chance. You're going to start a follow-on fire, and then they're going to tick them down with the fire dot. So a good combination of torpedo DPM, lots of flood chances, and then follow-up fires with the Benham. Lastly, you can get the torpedo reload down from the base 85 seconds to roughly 80 seconds with back in stock at Mastery 3 of 4, or if you really want to go hard and heavy in the paint and dump a lot of commendations into your USDD commander, max out back in stock, you can get it down to 78 seconds, but that's at an extreme opportunity cost for slot 3 on any of these commanders, because you're giving up either twist and track or glass cannon. So is that really worth it to shave, 5 seconds or at absolute maxed out 7 seconds off the reload to give up glass cannon or twist and track, depending on how you're using or who you're using? I don't know if that's a trade that's worthwhile necessarily. A better way to think about these torps, since it's 2 sets of quad launchers per side, is to think not that your torpedo reload is 85 seconds for 16 torps, but rather that you've got 8 torps on tap every 42.5 seconds. And when you think of it like that, you're like, oh, well, I've got 8 torps every 42 seconds. That's better than the Moss. That's better than Kagero. So you start thinking about like, oh, compared to the other 8 torp type of boats, I've actually got a better reload. And then you just need to flip the boat around, and you've got great gun turret traverse to be able to keep up with you constantly flipping back and forth, so there's no worries there. Your guns are always going to be ready to rock and roll when you need them. So think not of this boat with an 85 second 16 torp reload, but rather a 42.5 second 8 torp reload. Moving on now to maneuverability, we've got a 36.5 knot top speed on the Benham, which is worse than the tech tree counterpart Benson and slower than everything else on the tech tree except the Jervis. So you're definitely not outrunning anyone in this boat, and you're not chasing anybody down in this boat. Must be all the weight of those torpedoes sitting in the hull dragging this thing down. The rudder shift is 3.4 seconds and a 560 meter turning circle. So that may feel a little bit sluggish, especially if you're going to run a skill like Observant Rage or Sidestep that nerf your rudder shift. You may want to consider running rudder shift in slot 2 if you are running those skills that nerf the rudder shift. Since you're going to want to be flipping back and forth, torps off one side, torps off the other, and there's nothing you can really do about your turning circle, you may want to help out that flipping back and forth with as good a rudder shift as you can possibly get. I do not have time to top, time to stop type of statistics right now because I can only achieve those by playing the ship. So those will have to come when I'm done with the Havoc and can get you those stats when I'm actually taking this thing out into the open ocean. Lastly, moving on to concealment stats for the Benham, you'll notice immediately the 7.1 kilometer detectability by sea. Now, assuming you take a 10% concealment systems, which you're going to take because it's a destroyer, a maxed out 6% Look at Me Now, which is only a 12 Legend 2 commander, not too high of an ask, and a roughly 5% Bay inspiration, depending on what level he's at, but we'll say roughly a 5% Bay. That's going to get your concealment down to 5.609 concealment. So roughly 5.6 is how it'll report here on the game. It's a very low 5.6. Now, if you also slotted in a relatively high level Swirsky, you could push this down to like 5.4, but you've burned a bunch of promotion materials on Swirsky, and you've burned an inspiration slot on your USDD commander. Is that worth it? Not entirely sure, but that's kind of like the absolute maximum best concealment you could possibly get is into that kind of 5.4 range. Now, if we remember back to the torpedo statistics of 7.5 kilometer range, this is only going to give you a roughly 1.9 to maybe 2.1 if you're using that Swirsky build stealth torp band between your blue and your white on your torpedoes. This is not a very comfortable band of quote-unquote stealth torp at tier 6. I mean, it's really not comfortable at any tier, but if you get caught out in the open that close to tiers 5 through 7 cruisers, battleships, other DDs, that's extremely uncomfortable, and you're probably going to pay the price for it by going to the bottom pretty quickly. So this is again why we were talking about in torpedoes that 7.5 kilometer range. When you factor that in with this pretty bad concealment, it really does not lend itself to all that great of torpedo systems all around. You know, torpedoes in isolation are not the whole picture. You really have to also consider the concealment. And at absolute best 5.4, most people are going to have at best about 5.6. It's really not that comfortable of a band. I do want to also make note of the 3.6 kilometer air detection. The Benson and the Jervis have 3.0. The Minsk has 3.2. And everything else at tier 6 on the tech tree is below 3.0 air detection. That is terrible. Especially when you consider that if you're trying to get the torps involved, you're going to be pushing up really close. Most battleships have planes. Pretty much all cruisers have planes. There's planes in the air all over the place, and they're coming. Aircraft carriers are coming. The worst air detection at the tier for a destroyer is probably going to get you in trouble way more often than you would first think. But that couple hundred meters makes the difference a lot if you're trying to creep in as close as you can to get your 7.5 kilometer torps to work. So keep that in mind. You're the worst, least stealthy thing by air at the tier by a considerable margin. 400 meters worse than the Minsk, 600 meters worse than the tech tree counterpart Benson, and over a kilometer worse than some of the other ships. That's pretty terrible. I also want to make note of the smoke fire penalty of 2.6. This is worse than some ships that have 130 millimeter guns, like some of the French DDs, and when you consider that American DDs, one of their main tactics is to pop their extremely lengthy and huge smoke screens and then sit in them and shoot. having a worse smoke fire penalty than something with bigger guns just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me, and I'd like to see that 2.6 drop to like 2.5 or 2.4 kilometer penalty for the smoke fire. I do want to briefly touch on these three things in the overview. Extended smoke, yep, it's got standard American DD smoke. Sluggish shot, yep, we talked about that. It's not actually difficult to aim at long distances, it's just difficult to hit things that are actively maneuvering unless you're really good with predicting their maneuvers. Bad ballistics, or whatever you want to call them, sluggish ballistics, have nothing to do with your actual precision and dispersion. Those factors are totally irrelevant. It's just a matter of hitting maneuvering targets. Big yield, I want to talk about that. 9,000 damage is not big yield. I don't know why this is on there. Yes, your maximum alpha strike if you land all 8 or all 16 torps is relatively large, but A, that's rarely going to happen, and B, torpedo belts. You're going to be doing 4, 5, 6,000 damage most of the time per torp. So big yield should not be in there. I don't understand why it's in there. That's why I put absolutely no stock in these overview things, because they're selected, it seems like, at random out of a hat, and they rarely, if ever, actually apply to the ship. So keep that in mind. Don't use the overview to give you a sense of how these ships play. You got to look at the stats on paper. You got to actually look at the ship model, get a sense of how this thing is actually going to play. Those overview bullet points are relatively useless. Lastly, I'd love to show you the consumable stats, but hashtag Dear Wargaming, we need to be able to see the consumable statistics of ships we don't own. Currently can't do that, so I can't confirm with you the consumable statistics and give you those detailed stats and the exact parameters of them, but it is a standard kind of lengthy US destroyer smokescreen and a very bog standard destroyer speed boost. So look at other ships and you can pull those stats for yourself. I do want to talk about the role of this boat. Now, again, I haven't played it, but for the most part, you can kind of gather the role of a ship just by physically looking at the model and assessing what the stats are on paper. I think this is a hybrid ship. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out my Case for Von Spee video where I talk about destroyers on a spectrum. I think that this Benham is a hybrid boat that skews towards the guns, much like the British destroyers. The torps are probably more usable than the Bensons, Fletchers, Mayhans, given just the sheer number of them and the unique kind of wing-mounted 8 off one, then 8 off the other, every 42.5 seconds type of arrangement and playstyle, good angles, narrow spreads, etc. But a torp boat, this is not. This is not a German torp boat. This is not even a French hybrid skewing towards torp boat. And this is definitely not anything like a Japanese torpedo boat. This is a hybrid that skews towards the guns. I'd say even more skewing towards the guns than the British destroyers. There's no way to really make the torps shine, and I still want you to think about this role for the Benham as more of a Mahan or Benson role, where you can use the guns, focus on the guns, and then when there's an opportunity for the torps to get involved, you know, take that opportunity, seize upon it, but do not try to force torps. Do not try to force that 7.5 range with a pretty atrocious concealment. What you want to do, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but you've got that high kind of chance at floods. Any given torp is not going to necessarily set floods guaranteed, but you're probably going to land quite a few of them, just given the nature of 8 per spread, and then 40 seconds later you got 8 more off the other side. So you're probably going to get a decent number of floods just by rolling the dice a whole lot of times. Force out the damage con, and then hit them with the guns, rapid firing, rapid reloading, 5% fire chance, set that follow on fire after the damage con cools down. I think this is an incredibly powerful destroyer against other destroyers. It's got those American destroyer gun characteristics, and in that close-in fight with those good firing angles, you're going to launch the torps out at DDs. Now, the primary intent is not to hit them, it's to get them thinking about those. 8 torps and then you wiggle and waggle, you got 8 more at them. They're dodging 16 torps, just an absolute wall of skill coming at them. They're not shooting back at you, and if you do land one, sure, it might not completely knock them out, but they're going to be so weak that your American DD, DPM, and good turret traverse is going to win you that fight. Another thing you can be doing is gunfighting one guy and torping at another guy, and maybe get some pretty decent double strikes here and there against 2 DDs at once. It makes other DDs stop in their tracks and say, whoa, he's got good gun DPM, good gun characteristics up close with that turret traverse, and I got to worry about 16 torps? Whew, not getting into a close-in gunfight with a Benham, says the enemy DDs. Well, that's kind of the on-paper overview. Unfortunately, we don't have any gameplay footage for y'all today. That'll be coming in a couple of weeks. I am going to try to finish off all of the hard mode challenges to try to get the Benham at least 1 week early so we can take a look at it out on the high seas. Thanks an awful lot for listening, everybody. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the Benham on paper. How have you been dealing with it out on the high seas? Because we do have some wallet warriors out there that have already gotten it. So, what has been your experience when you've come up against it? And lastly, who are you thinking for slotting in on this? Are you going to run the Twist and Track Observant Rage Halsey build? Or are you going to run Burke? I'm personally leaning a little bit towards Burke for this build. So, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on all those things. Again, thanks an awful lot for listening. I greatly appreciate it. And as always, stay salty, Commanders.